Welcome to the first of 3 reflections. I'm Jenny Sinclair from Together for the Common Good. In each of these reflections, I'm going to invite you to explore together what it means to be a justice-seeking church. In this first reflection, we're going to start by examining what's going on in terms of the injustice we see. In the second, we're going to look at the dynamic between the church and poor communities. And in the third, we'll explore in practical terms what a justice-seeking church looks like. So we're going to start by reading the signs of the times. We're living through a period of great instability, and to be an authentic justice-seeking church, we need to understand what's going on. So we're going to be reading the signs of the times in several ways, by looking at the reality on the ground, listening to God, listening to each other, and to our neighbours, and through dwelling in passages from Scripture. First, let's think about our response to poverty. Let's spend a moment of silence with this passage from Deuteronomy. I'll give you a moment to read this. Notice if there's a word or phrase that stands out for you. What do you notice? Through translations down the centuries, we can lose touch with the original meaning of ancient words. You might have noticed the word lending. Some scholars believe that the ancient meaning of lending money in the Hebrew meant something closer to our understanding of accompaniment. Lending as accompaniment? How different is that from the way we address money, poverty, and debt today, where help looks like cash transferred between bank accounts, leaving a person on their own. This prompts us to think about the differences between models of justice. The modern welfarist and utilitarian approaches to justice, like the way the British welfare state currently operates, are materialist. They prioritise efficiency. By contrast, the Christian justice tradition is rooted in the ancient rabbinical tradition of right relationship with God and with each other. That means it's not materialist, but acknowledges the transcendent. In God's economy, if you're having a hard time, I'm to walk in relationship with you, accompany you till you get back on your feet. It may involve lending money, or it may mean I help you get a job, or just keep you company. Not just a cash transfer, not a system that rationalizes out opportunities for human connection. God made us as relational beings who are meant to accompany each other, not abandon our neighbours who are struggling on their own. This Christian notion of justice is anchored in God's economy of mutual obligation. It's based on a different foundation from the materialist approaches to justice. It's important to remember this as we go forward, because if we make the wrong call, we can inadvertently prop up an unjust system. Now remember, there's no such thing as a neutral worldview. So let me tell you the theological position I'm taking. I listen and learn across the Christian traditions, and in particular, I draw on the Catholic social thought tradition. It's intended for all people of goodwill, not just for Catholics. It's concerned with upholding God's creation, especially the human person. It addresses everything from family to evangelization, to economy, to nature, to peace and justice. Its stated purpose is to build a civilization of love. It calls for the reform of any system that's dehumanizing, systems that prioritize profit over the needs of families and communities, systems that centralize too much power to the bureaucratic state. It's non-partisan and is always looking for balance. This is a tradition that's not utopian. So, what's going on? What injustice do we see? We see that young people can't afford a home and that social trust is breaking down. These are just some of many interconnected symptoms. Let's zoom out to a bigger picture. Just over 8 years ago, Pope Francis said, "We're not entering an era of change, but a change of era." Every era is characterized by a particular philosophy which shapes the political economy. The animating idea of the current era that's breaking down comes from the philosophy of liberalism, whose roots are in the Enlightenment. Some of that legacy was positive, but in the last 45 years, it morphed into an ideology known as neoliberalism. This system is founded on a false anthropology, a soulless conception of the human being, which generates a false idea of freedom from constraint. In its extreme form, it sees family as a constraint, and tradition, accountability, and mutual obligation are seen as obstacles to progress. Even relationship to place is reframed as old-fashioned. How different is this from a Christian anthropology, where human beings are transcendent, relational beings made in the image of God? This neoliberal philosophy shows up in economics and in social and moral forms. Its flawed anthropology explains why the systems it generates turn out to be inherently unstable. To see how this culture undermines the Christian calling of love, peace, and justice, let's turn to the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Rashi, the great medieval Jewish scholar, asserted that 4/5 of the people actually refused to heed God's call. They preferred to stay behind. In pointing this out, he was warning his own people against assimilation to the comforts of the dominant culture. And today, it's also tempting to choose the security of slavery to a decadent but apparently prosperous empire, rather than taking the risk that comes with true freedom of a life with God. Our modern pharaohs offer a different kind of slavery, a list of pseudo-freedoms. They say you can have mobility, consumer choice, rights, and self-determination. These false freedoms serve the interests of a few, but their captivity is bad for humanity. And from this philosophy, we get a particular form of financial system, and from this, globalization, economic processes that serve the interests of big corporations. This operating system has led to the concentration of capital and the accumulation of unprecedented wealth. And its power has achieved influence over governments, who are now geared to serving the interests of capital over the democratic will of their own populations. Catholic social teaching shows us that when financial capital dominates, it has a tendency to dehumanize and exploit. Its business is the commodification of creation and the financialization of everything. Land, water, homes, human beings. Just think of gig economy jobs, insecure zero-hour contract jobs. Workers take all the risk and the company gets most of the profit. Like Uber, you provide your own car, or Airbnb, you provide your own flat. Just like in ancient Egypt, where slaves had to provide their own straw. This system requires units of labour to be cheap and mobile. 4 decades ago, the idea of moving to find work was regarded as right-wing, but now it's rebranded as freedom. As jobs were moved around the world to low-wage economies, the already wealthy got richer, while catastrophic damage was done to the natural world and whole sections of societies were discarded. We've seen civic degradation on a vast scale. This transactional freedom broke parts of our country. This financialization affects people's lives. We can see it in post-industrial and coastal towns where the heart of the community has gone. This was a politics of abandonment, a breach of the common good. All governments over the last 40 years have colluded in this culture of contract. We have a toxic cycle, a low-wage, high-welfare economy with increasingly precarious and meaningless jobs rewarded with wages too low to live on, subsidized by the public purse making up the difference. Importing low-paid workers away from their own countries and families to prop up Western economies. A shocking 5.2 million people in the UK are abandoned on out-of-work benefits, creating a dysfunction that generates social problems requiring more state intervention, which, because it's over-centralised and non-relational, generates more problems. We see governments colluding to insulate big corporations from democratic processes. There's been a power grab by the principalities and powers, the modern pharaohs. And after decades of no correction to the devastation, the so-called left behind around the world had enough of this mismanagement. They literally had nothing to lose. Their reactions, framed by the modern pharaohs as populist, would in previous eras have been understood as a peasants' revolt. But this neoliberal philosophy generates social consequences too. Its culture of self places rights above responsibilities. It's an assault on relationship. We're groomed to outsource the things to the market and the state that we used to do, weakening families and communities. Every country that follows this system is affected. The motivation of its spirit is anti-human, which is why the system is now unraveling. We're faced with a disintegration. And none of our governments have had the guts to challenge the neoliberal consensus, and there's no sign of this changing. Securonomics simply means more of the same. The cost of living crisis is just the latest in a wider crisis unfolding across the West. Pope Francis describes this as a malign culture. We see its symptoms in low productivity, extreme inequality, massive public and private debt. And we see it in the collapse of trust in institutions, the weakening of democracy, subordination of the local by digital culture, in sclerotic health systems, in the atrophy of local forms of human association, in the disconnect between the managerial class and the population. We see it in climate warming and the tragedy of displaced people. We see it in the liberalising of abortion and euthanasia, in the commercialisation of surrogacy, in the normalising of cosmetic surgery, in organ harvesting, sexual exploitation, in human trafficking. And not least, we see this malign culture in symptoms of human distress, rises in loneliness, highest among the young, in rises in addiction, self-harm, depression and nihilism, in the tyranny of social media culture selling a false idea of freedom. How far have we strayed from Jesus' wish for his people to live life to the full? Such a system has spiritual and moral consequences too. A system that denies the primacy of God creates a cult of self, individualism. And this is why we see the emergence on both the extreme left and the extreme right of identitarian politics, distorted forms of victimhood, the battle of rights and the culture wars. The modern pharaohs deny the transcendent and assert the material. This denial subverts natural law and generates an anti-human system that some call the machine. It generates a demoralization and poverty in all its forms, economic, relational, and spiritual. Now, against this backdrop, one might expect Christians who care about injustice to offer some resistance. Some bravely are doing so, but many either cannot see what is going on or choose not to. Too many enjoy the comforts of the modern Egypt. Back in the time of Moses, the people were moaning, murmuring, nostalgic for the decadence of their Egypt. As Moses might have said to the Israelites leaving Egypt, choose freedom in God, not the false freedoms of the machine. While God builds relationships, the machine deceives and unravels. The unraveling is real. The old era is giving way to a new world order whose character is yet unknown. So how should we respond when we're in a place we've never been before? We may need to adopt a sense of tragic realism. But Catholic social teaching is a resource that can help us navigate this confusion. Its express purpose is to build a civilization of love. It calls for the powers of capital and state to be decentralized through regional banks and energy providers to counterbalance the power of the big international giants, through the renewal of democratic processes at regional and local levels, and by shortening food and energy supply chains. It emphasizes local accountability through institutions such as unions, churches, associations, and local businesses. It asserts the preferential option for the poor and insists on the dignity of work as the cornerstone of a common good politics. It prioritizes families and communities. And our relational justice tradition gives us a firm foundation as a resistance against the modern pharaohs. We're called to build God's economy, through a reweaving of covenantal relationships in the places where we live and work. In this reflection, we saw why we are called to resist the captivity of this modern Egypt and join with God in his mission to transform the world. In the next two reflections, we'll look at the dynamics between the church and poor communities and why we're called to become a relational, justice-seeking church and what that looks like in practice. Let's end with a moment of silence as we contemplate this passage from Exodus. Note what stands out for you, and together reflect on the question, who are the modern pharaohs?